Hey, what's going on guys? My name is Nick and welcome back to another episode of Technical. It's the show where Nick talks tech. I'm your host Nick, so let's talk tech. Today we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle and how it will point you in the right direction. I can't believe I wrote that. In previous videos we discussed how to take control of your image and make it look the way that you want. But it's a lot of info and there's got to be a good way to remember how all of these things are connected, right? Yep, it's called the exposure triangle. It may not be perfect, but I think as far as visual aids go, it's pretty neat, and it can be very helpful if you're just starting out. If you remember, there were 3 in-camera settings we talked about in terms of manipulating the exposure or the amount of light in your scene. The aperture, which is the hole in the lens which the light travels through. The shutter speed, which is how long your sensor is exposed to light for. And the ISO, which is an amplification of certain values that your camera sensor records. More commonly described as how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. Although we know that isn't exactly true. All 3 of these settings allow us to control the amount of light in our image, but each one of them has some side effects. The wider the aperture is, the more light will be in your scene, however, the less of your image will be in focus. The depth of field will become shallower. The longer your shutter speed, the more light will collect onto your sensor, but the motion will become blurrier. And finally, the higher your ISO values, the brighter your image will be, but you could end up with some grain or visual noise in your image. The exposure triangle is a way for us to look at all of these factors at once and determine what settings we need to get a properly exposed image, so our subject isn't too bright or too dark. We can see all 3 of our variables and how they will change our image as a whole. The meter inside your camera will help you determine what settings need to change to get a properly exposed image. If you choose a particular aperture and shutter speed, the meter in your camera will determine what ISO you'll need in order to get a properly exposed image. And these settings will vary from situation to situation. The exposure triangle is a way to visualize what the meter is doing. By assigning values to the sides of the triangle, we can figure out where our exposure will end up when we start changing our settings. In auto mode, your camera will balance these 3 settings for you, so you can spend more time on things like composition and framing. You may not want to juggle all these settings at once. Some cameras have scene modes which will help you expose for a particular situation. For example, sports mode might prioritize a high shutter speed for crisp images of fast motion, while something like portrait mode may prioritize larger apertures so you can blur the background more and isolate your subject. There are also priority modes, like shutter priority mode, which will let you choose the specific shutter speed value that you want. The meter will then take care of everything else. Something like aperture priority mode will allow you to choose the specific aperture that you want, while the meter will take care of the other settings for you. And taking the camera into manual mode will give you control over all 3 of the settings. However, this is where the exposure triangle begins to solidify the idea of there being a correct exposure. And yes, technically you'll be able to see your subjects more clearly if they're properly exposed, but you may not always want that. Think about silhouettes. They are super underexposed. But does that mean they're bad images? Not at all. The exposure isn't the end-all be-all of photography. There's so much more to think about. Composition, color, contrast, and a million billion more other things, which means I can make a million billion more videos. Now there are some people who think that using 3 sliders as opposed to a triangle is a more accurate representation of these 3 camera settings, and having the values lined up can help you more accurately determine the amount of light in your scene. And they're right, but I just don't think it looks as cool. Look, I'm a math guy, I have a dang degree in the subject, but sometimes visual charts with clearly laid out information is more digestible than strict numbers and formulas. Whichever method helps you to remember the relationship between these settings is the one you should be using. Or don't, and just wing it. Just remember, if you really want to add more light into your scene, you could always just buy another light. Or if you want to make things darker, you can always buy an ND filter. But that's a video for another day. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Remember though, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are just tools to help you capture an image. And the exposure triangle is just a way to help you keep a handle on all that information. Eventually, with enough practice, you'll be able to turn your camera into manual mode and juggle all these variables with confidence. Well, that's it for this video. Did I leave something out or get something wrong? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll put my sources in the description so you can fact check me. And while you're down there, make sure you like the video, ring that bell for notifications, and subscribe so you don't miss another video. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bonus fact, this is one of the reasons that movie sets often have dedicated camera crews. It can be hard to keep track of all this information, especially if you're focused on directing or something. But with enough practice, I'm sure you'll be able to handle it. Or just keep your camera in auto mode. I'll never tell.